you very much, Sahar, for that very kind introduction. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. Perfect. Okay. Thank you very much for the invitation, Terhai, for coming to Reclaim. I mean, it's just a fantastic conference, and this is my first year being a part of it. And thank you to the Western Diocese, to Surpazan, to all the organizers. I'm very excited to speak today. So today what I want to talk about is artificial intelligence. In particular, it can be kind of daunting when you first play with the tools that are released by Google, by Facebook, by all these companies, because you just become overwhelmed. You get this feeling that they can do practically everything. And that's exactly how I felt. And in fact, I was doing research and continue to do research on artificial intelligence and applications to problems in physics and biology. And I find that actually, they're not nearly as impressive in these domains. They can do quite a lot, but they have very obvious pitfalls. And so it makes you start understanding that we are really far away from any sort of intelligence. And what I want to discuss today is how human intelligence and human creativity is far higher than what we can produce with these kinds of machines, and how through our faith we can understand these things very clearly. Okay, so a bit about where I'm from. So I grew up in Washington State, in Redmond, which is where Microsoft campus is. So already a lot of technological AI stuff going on right where I was born. So I went to a local elementary school there, then I went to a STEM high school also nearby, and then I did my undergrad at the University of Washington. And the University of Washington was in some sense also very heavily influenced by the computer science department, which I also studied in mathematics there. So already at that time I was getting exposed to some of the more active ideas of artificial intelligence in my undergrad. And then I went to Boston and I did my PhD in math and statistics at MIT. And at that point there was just an explosion of work coming out of AI labs. So in terms of just covering this timeline, right, when I was in elementary school, we essentially had calculators, and we also had graphing calculators, and those were very fun because you could download games on them and play on them. But that was, to some degree, already impressive because, well, when the teacher wasn't looking, you could pull them out and try to compute some things, right? Then in high school, we got very familiar with doing all sorts of Google searches and Khan Academy for drilling all sorts of exercises to be able to solve the problems that were given to us. When I was in college, I started already doing research on artificial intelligence for predicting the dynamics of physical systems, and I'll talk a bit about that later in the slides. And also I took a lot of math courses where they would give you really complicated, scary integrals. And an amazing tool came out called Wolfram Alpha, where you could plug in these integrals, and it would exactly correctly give you the way to solve them. So it would just give you the answer back, which at the time was very fascinating. And then we started noticing that things like neural networks are becoming very popular and are able to produce all sorts of interesting images or do certain tasks like sentence completion. And then by the end of undergrad, we got to see driverless cars, so it was really living proof that these things can do something very impressive. Okay, and then in graduate school, it exploded, like I said. We got ChatGPT, we had all sorts of generative AI for images, and artificial intelligence even started incurring into biology and solving protein folding problems, which the recent Nobel Prize was given for. Okay, so what I want to talk about today is not how artificial intelligence is some sort of absolute evil. It is a very useful tool, but by actually working with it and by looking into our faith, we can really understand that it is nothing more than a tool. It has a rightful place to be. It can improve our productivity. give us certain amounts of insights, but really humans are the ones that harness creativity in the work that they do. Okay. So to talk about creativity, I want to start with obtaining knowledge, and then how knowledge leads to wisdom. Okay, so my background is in mathematics, and there are a couple of lessons that I've taken away from capturing knowledge and obtaining wisdom in your field from my studies of math. So in mathematics, one of the main things that we try to do is we prove theorems about whether something is possible or not, or whether some equation is correct or not. And when you prove theorems, you really understand that they're either right or wrong. There's no in between. So either the statement is correct or it's false. You also learn that you're going to do really bad on your math exams if you just try to memorize things, because everything is derivable from first principles. And so the students that do the best on the test are the ones who remember how to make these connections, start with some of the basic assumptions that were given to them in class, and rederive the more complicated results. Sometimes you can arrive at solutions to math problems by just like brute force computation, but usually you actually have to have some unexpected insight. So even Albert Einstein, he had a famous quote saying that in order to solve a certain problem, you have to take a different route than what you used to arrive at that problem formulation. So leaving the area that you're thinking in and then coming back to it from a different angle is very useful in mathematics. Okay, so just one example of this is there's a very beautiful interplay of number theory and geometry. So the classical example being Pythagorean's theorem, saying that a squared plus b squared equals c squared gives you the formula for the hypotenuse or the longest side of a right angle triangle. So you can view this thing as a statement about numbers. You can also view it as a geometric identity. Okay, and the last thing that just maybe you'd be surprised because you think mathematicians don't communicate, but it actually turns out that they do, and it is probably the biggest part of the job. So mathematicians value very highly writing things out with pencil and paper, writing on chalkboards. We call these things chalk talks, where you go on a chalkboard and you present in front of your fellow community, and face-to-face communication, going to somebody's office and detailing to them the arguments of your proof are very, very highly valued. So to kind of give you an example of this, I want to show you a video where a few years back, there was a certain supply of chalk, which was highly treasured by mathematicians, and it started running out because the company was shutting down. And mathematicians knew that this chalk was so useful for their ideation, creativity process, that they started hoarding it. So I'll show you a brief snippet of this. Can you do this?
It's impossible to write
Yeah.
a false theorem.
I assume the special version.
Did you share your sound?
Let me try. Do you know how to share sound?
On this side, right? Sure. Just now. Put the mic.
At the top of Zoom, there's a share.
Let's see if this works.
Around this chart is that it's impossible to write a false theorem.
I assume special. I assume.
It's the microphone.
Okay, well, roughly you can see the video playing. Basically what they talk about in this video, maybe you heard the beginning, somebody said that with this chalk, it's impossible to write a false theorem. So this chalk is so smooth, it works better than any other chalk, that it provides just the right resistance for you to think about your problem, but not so much that you get carried away in the process of physically pushing a piece of chalk into a board. Okay. So anyways, they're serious, they love their chalk. So we really value communicating in this way. Okay, so why is this the case? Why do we really care about making our lives hard and writing on chalkboards? Well, that's because your brain actually really benefits from the introduction of these types of artificial hardships. Right? Our brains are wired for interacting with the natural world, so they learn effectively when you do things like writing on a board. So this will somehow increase the synaptic connections that you're making to learn whatever field you're interested in studying. Okay, so a relatively small portion of the brain called the hippocampus is the place where you actually can create new neurons, and this place, this region of the brain is important for learning and memory. And there's recent studies coming out showing that actually these new neurons that get created in this region of the brain, they die off unless you engage in effortful learning. So if you don't do anything, and you don't try to actively learn, you're not going to need them, your brain's going to dispose of them. Okay, so to summarize, basically, our brain's ability to memorize is improved through all of these types of activities, through handwritten notes, through chalkboard talks, through various mnemonics, right? So if you ask like any medical student, they would probably tell you that all of these tools are incredibly effective for memorizing what they need for their exams. Okay, great. So that tells us a little bit about like how do you obtain knowledge. And in general, when you go into a classroom setting, most teachers have a rough understanding of how they want their students to obtain knowledge. So they view this as something like a hierarchy, where at the lowest level of the hierarchy, all you need to do is just remember what the teacher told you and to be able to regurgitate it back. Next, you have understanding, so you're able to maybe like interpret a little bit deeper what these facts mean. Then you're able to actually apply some of this knowledge to solve problems. You can analyze new problem formulations, judge the quality of new ideas, and at the very end, actually create new problems entirely. So if you start at the bottom, also, by the way, is this taskbar visible or is it out of the way?
No.
Okay, so at the bottom of this hierarchy, right, there are many biblical verses that actually tell you that this process of starting with knowledge formation, leading all the way to creativity and wisdom is a very important process. So in Proverbs 19:20, it says, "Listen to advice and accept instruction that you may gain wisdom in the future." So start at the bottom, and eventually you will arrive at obtaining wisdom. Okay, so what is wisdom? Well, roughly you can think of it as the upper part of this hierarchy. The Hebrew word for this is chokhmah, which essentially means not just having knowledge, but being able to apply it. So being able to actually use this actively. Okay, so in Proverbs 23:12, we hear that we're instructed to apply our heart to instruction and our ears to words of knowledge. So really apply what you have learned. And this is kind of where it ends in terms of what you would get from a teacher in a classroom. They don't tell you a very important piece of this hierarchy, which is that at the very top, you actually have God. You have Jesus Christ, and you have inspiration through the Holy Spirit. So Proverbs 2:6 says that for the Lord gives wisdom, from his mouth comes knowledge and understanding. And this is something that we don't think about that often, that actually all of the deep insight and understanding, which we call wisdom, comes from the Lord. So even when Jesus Christ came to give his deeper interpretation of Scripture, really give true understanding to people, he spoke in parables. He tried to give us ways to understand what he was talking about, and it came from the Lord. So when Paul writes to the Corinthians, he actually, in some sense, rebukes them and says that wisdom is not coming from you. He says it is because of him that you are in Christ Jesus, who has become for us wisdom from God, that is our righteousness, holiness, and redemption. So it's very important to remember that there is a directionality, that we cannot just claim all of these ideas as purely fictions of our brain. This is coming from a higher place. And this is something that some of the best and most famous scientists have believed in, that these types of ideas do come from a higher place. So you have Paul Erdos, who was one of the most brilliant mathematicians of the 20th century. And he believed that all of the most beautiful mathematical statements and their corresponding proofs were collected in some holy grail, some book of mathematics. So when he saw a new argument, and it had a very beautiful proof, he would say, this one is from the book, meaning that like, this is a good one. Although I wouldn't recommend you to read his other statements on religion. He didn't really have any sort of beliefs. But just to mention that this was a person who believed that mathematics came from a higher place. Okay. Albert Einstein had very interesting views on God and religion. And he also didn't believe in what we would call a Christian God, but he did believe in a God who, he said, reveals himself in the orderly harmony of what exists. And lastly, Max Planck, who was actually a devout Christian Lutheran, and he actually transitioned from physics, and the later part of his life was lecturing a lot on the coexistence, harmony of religion and science, and he would make quotes like, both religion and science need for their activities the belief in God. So really, I mean, you see that there's kind of this gradient of scientists who maybe don't have a very structured view of religion to scientists that have a very structured Christian view of religion. But really, in all cases, they believed that they were getting their inspiration and their wisdom from a higher place. Okay. So if we're getting this wisdom from a higher place, through our studies, we're eventually able to learn something from God, then it's important to understand how to communicate this correctly. Okay, and in general, scientists take communication of their ideas very seriously, like we saw on this example of chalk talks. So Max Born said that to present a scientific subject in an attractive and stimulating manner is an artistic task similar to that of a novelist or even a dramatic writer. And this holds the same for writing textbooks. So you'll hear this really with many great academicians today. You'll hear that they put at least 25% of their time into presentation of their work. Richard Feynman, who was one of the renowned, one of the best physicists of the 20th century, Nobel Prize winner, said that the ultimate test of your knowledge is your capacity to convey it to another. And also in Proverbs, we hear things like, the heart of the wise makes his speech judicious and adds persuasiveness to his lips. So we see that you need to take great importance in how you present your work. When you present your work, it actually increases your knowledge, so there's a feedback to your knowledge of the subject. And also, when you truly understand the subject well, you will be able to speak about it persuasively. Okay. So then what happens if you don't have that wisdom? If you have not done enough seeking in your field to obtain this kind of deep knowledge, deep wisdom, then in that case, the Bible is very clear. It says that we need to be humble and we need to learn more. So in Proverbs, you hear things like, when words are many, transgression is not lacking, but whoever restrains his lips is prudent. So really just learn first and then speak. And the less you speak, actually, the better. Okay. And so this gets me to ChatGPT, which, by the way, I think is a lovely tool. I use it almost every day. But it's important to understand that ChatGPT, it's sentence completion. It's choosing the next likely word to predict in a sentence. You ask it a question, and it just probabilistically infers word by word what it's going to say. There's no reasoning, there's no logic. So we need to understand that in some sense, this is just empty talk, what it's doing. So you can ask it a question about designing a website, and it will just one by one add words to make a long sentence. And it really is remarkable how fantastic it is at giving back cohesive, sometimes interesting responses with such a kind of banal approach to solving this problem. So Terence Tao, one of the kind of most impressive mathematicians of our time, professor at UCLA, says that ChatGPT is a mediocre but not completely incompetent graduate student. And so the reason why he says this is because ChatGPT can be viewed as a summarization of everything the internet can tell you about a subject. And it's usually sort of a dumbed-down summarization, something that anybody could understand, even a person that's not a specialist in the field. And the most important thing about it is that it's static. It has no ability to really evolve itself or ask new questions or study new directions. So it's just a static summary of what we know. And that's why Terence Tao says that it's a bad graduate student. Because if you give a good graduate student a question, they're going to do some exploration, they're going to read online, and then they're going to find something new and come back and tell you something that you didn't think about. Okay. So given that we understand that these types of machine learning tools do not really have wisdom, that wisdom is really a property of God that then is communicated to us. Can we trust machine learning tools to solve our problems and communicate new ideas? So in order to think about that, we need to actually understand what is machine learning doing. Okay, so there's several tasks that machine learning tools excel at. So one of them is discovering patterns. AI machine learning tools, so they can find patterns in data. So you can give it, for example, an image where you've cut out maybe some central part of the image, and then it will try to give you the most likely thing to fill it in with. Because it's seen a lot of images of people's faces in the past, it can kind of guess what this woman's face should look like. Okay, other places where patterns come up, as Armenians, we love chess, right? And you probably all heard of Garry Kasparov's match against Deep Blue, and how in a rematch he failed to beat this computer that was made by IBM, and it was a sad day for all Armenians around the world. Right, and Garry Kasparov, after this, right, he actually wrote a book called Deep Thinking, Where Artificial Intelligence Ends and Human Creativity Begins. And in this book, he talks a lot about kind of what his view on artificial intelligence is and where it's going. And one of the kind of summaries you get from his book is that as long as people keep on thinking and solving problems, these machines, they won't make us obsolete. So in some sense, the ability of this thing to beat him in chess is more of a statement about the simplicity and the constraints of chess than it is about the intelligence of these types of machines. Okay. What else can machine learning tools do? Well, they can find relationships in data. So if you collect a bunch of data of people going out on the street on any given day, and you look at whether it was sunny or rainy that day, then a machine learning algorithm might look at this data and predict that, well, if it's sunny, 20% of the time a person will take an umbrella, 80% of the time they won't. Whereas if it's rainy, then with a high probability, we've looked through the data, we found that they're going to take an umbrella and only 10% of the time they won't. Okay, so it can find these types of patterns in data. It can also fit data with lines or with more complicated curves, so it can do regression. Here I'm showing a picture of a parent's height versus their daughter's height. Okay. And one of the really fascinating things that machine learning can do, which I think is the crux of why we like these methods, is they can memorize billions and billions of data points that we feed into these algorithms. So there was a really wonderful paper from PNAS in 2020 where they showed that they could train a neural network by giving it a bunch of images of like a kid or a truck or a mug or other things. And then they could feed in complete noise into this neural network. So just like jumbled up images that don't mean anything. And they used a procedure to show that this neural network would then spit out the images that it was trained on. So basically this neural network, somewhere in all of its like weights, in its connections, it's storing all of the images that it was given as a training set. So here are some simulations they show where you can start with just a completely noisy, garbled image, and then eventually this neural network starts producing numbers for you, which is what you allowed it to see when you were training this whole architecture. Okay, so they find patterns, they're able to fit data, and most importantly, they're able to memorize the data that we give it. Okay, so these are all very useful parts of AI methods, and we use them to solve problems. So for example, AI now has made its way into all sorts of physics and applied science fields. So we now use it in AlphaFold to predict how proteins are going to fold based on their molecular backbone. There are people using it for prediction of tumor growth, people using it for climate forecasting. And in my personal research, I've used this to infer network structures from data to be able to match biological data sets to each other through optimization and to infer trajectories of how things move around in a video. Okay. So what have we learned from applying AI to life science? This really is kind of like the holy grail. If we could go and take artificial intelligence and be able to predict the evolution of natural physical systems, this would be much more impressive than saying whether an image is a dog or a cat, which is what a lot of traditional machine learning is focused on. So what have we learned from applying AI to natural systems? Well, we've learned really that the problems that are easy, that AI can solve very well, are those where you have a lot of similar examples of the same stuff going on. So if you ask AI to predict what's going to happen with a ball rolling down this hill, and you've given it a bunch of previous examples of a ball rolling down a hill at different points, it will roughly tell you that it's going to roll down in some amount of time that's linear with how high you put it up on this hill. Or if you give it like a mass on a spring, it will probably predict for you that this mass is going to oscillate up and down because it's seen a bunch of videos of this before. Okay. But if you give it something quite complex, like a turbulent fluid flow that's moving around very actively, it will suddenly start doing things wrong. So it might not conserve the mass of the fluid. So it might create like spurious growth in how much fluid there is in a given region, so it won't respect physical conservation laws. And one of the most striking examples of this is if you've seen these videos of AI trying to predict gymnasts moving around, it completely garbles up the shape of this gymnast body. So it has absolutely no understanding of the physical laws that govern this thing. Okay. So it becomes very clear that these AI methods, they have to be constrained. They have to be somehow encoded with physical laws. So a lot of the research that goes on now in machine learning for physics is called physics-constrained machine learning. We're trying to take the equations of physics and somehow force the machine learning method to respect them. Okay. So that's hard. And the thing that is very hard, in some sense, almost entirely out of reach, is using AI to make new predictions about physical or natural systems in regimes where we have very limited or no observations. Okay, so what's an example of this? Well, let's say we take a pot with water and we boil it. And so we see on Earth that we can take a bunch of pots with water, we can, turn them up to 100 degrees Celsius, and we're going to reach a boiling point, and the water will start boiling. So you can give a bunch of these videos to an AI machine learning tool, and it will probably think that no matter where you take this pot, you're always going to get water to boil. And it will probably also tell you that at room temperature, it's impossible to get water to boil. But in fact, we know that this is not the case. There is a whole, there's different phases that water can take, and depending on under what conditions you place water, it can have very different behaviors. So right now, currently, what we've done is we've just shown that if we take a pot of water and we put it on a stove and we heat it up, we're going to get it to boil. But what happens if we put water in a vacuum? So the surrounding pressure in the air is very, very low. And then you can actually see that in the setting, spontaneously the water will start to boil. Because the pressure of essentially the gas molecules are higher than the pressure of the surrounding air. They're going to start escaping, and this water will begin to boil at room temperature. So this is just to mention that we've never seen this before. We always thought that, oh, we need to put water on a stove for it to boil. But then you put it in this new environment where it's in a vacuum, where there's no surrounding pressure, and it has this new physical behavior, which a machine learning method would not be able to predict. Okay. So what is machine learning good at? Well, a classical problem it's good at solving is taking cat images and dog images and trying to predict whether they're cats or dogs. Okay. And the conventional wisdom that people in machine learning have derived is that all images of cats and dogs roughly live on some sort of higher dimensional surface. And if we were to live on this surface, then we could very naturally divide the region where cat images live and the region where dog images live. And so we could find a nice classifier by living on this surface. But the issue of this hypothesis, which we call the manifold hypothesis, is that you can have bad examples, which we call adversarial examples. So for example, you can take this dog, which looks very much like a cat, or this one here, or you can take a cat image that is noisy, it's corrupted, it looks very grainy, and now your machine learning algorithm is going to be completely horrible. It's never seen anything like this before, so it's similar to the example that we showed with the pot boiling at room temperature. Right. And so in machine learning, actually, they still don't really know what to do with these types of adversarial examples. They pop up everywhere, and they're very hard to take care of. Okay, so again, scientific phenomena, real-world phenomena, they have a huge number of adversarial examples. If we think cat and dog images are hard, physical phenomena are a whole different ballgame. So if you look at neurons, for example, neurons only fire when they're given a particular amount of current input, otherwise they don't. predator and prey models. If there's something wrong with the environment, if the resources are scarce, both populations might die out. They don't necessarily have to oscillate in terms of their populations. And then this last example, of course, the boiling of the water in a vacuum is something that you probably wouldn't be able to predict if you didn't know anything about the physics of your problem. Okay, so physical systems have a lot of these types of interesting scientific phenomena that if you don't know anything about the physics, you won't be able to predict. So how am I doing on time? Great. So last thing that I want to discuss now is we know the pitfalls. We thought these things were great. We realized that actually they have places where they can be quite poor. And now we need to understand how do we use this tool carefully. In particular, how do we avoid misusing AI tools? So we need to really just treat it as one step of a large problem-solving process. So, for example, if an AI bot suggests to us that we should paint this type of a picture, and we're a beginning artist that doesn't know how to paint people and umbrellas, then maybe we should take this picture and we should try to draw it by ourselves after AI suggested it to us, and maybe make some modifications along the way. And then lastly, once we've actually produced a work of art, we should go and try to put it up somewhere, communicate, maybe talk with other artists to get a sense of whether it's a good painting or a bad painting. In engineering, it works in a very similar way. People use machine learning to predict some sort of a engineered structure that maybe is going to be part of a building. But then the next natural step is you can't just end there. You can't just go and build a full building and hope that this thing works. So you need to first prototype it by building a smaller prototype. And then you need to understand, you need to know the physics of your problem to understand where the pitfalls of this are. And at the very end, you can build an entire building with this initial suggestion that you might have gotten out of an AI tool. Okay. So really this comes back down to the idea that human exploration and ideation is the only creative process that will lead to a real understanding of your problem. So just blindly taking an answer from AI and trying to implement it with not thinking deeply about what this answer is a bad idea. Okay. So largely you need to keep yourself just accountable. AI is like any other mechanism. It can become addictive because it just gives you fast answers that if you trust blindly, things can go wrong. So for example, if you're trying to solve a math problem and you ask AI for an answer, it gives you some suggestion for how to solve it. Then again, you still need to go back with pencil and paper and try to rederive it for yourself to train your brain to create these connections that you need to deeply understand the problem that you ask. And so this is very similar to giving a kid a calculator when they're in elementary school. It's exactly why we don't do this. And as adults, we just need to remember that whenever we enter a new field, we're like that kid with a calculator. And we need to restrain ourselves from using it too much. Okay. So this comes back down to the reason that AI is trained on a bunch of data of practically every field. So essentially what it's giving us is some rough approximation of the current ideas or wisdom that's been accumulated in the field. So if all you do is rely on this source of intelligence, you don't get past what people currently know. So if you want to produce new creative ideas, you really need to explore on your own. Okay. And so people have been using this, people who want to get into a new field have been using machine learning just as a way to stimulate their own ideation process. So the artists have been using AI to understand what kind of pictures they might want to draw. They've been using it to generate poetry as a source of inspiration to get around all sorts of writer's block, and even to prototype website design. And scientists now use it for the same reasons. So they can use it to search for new theorems about the structure of knots in mathematics. They can use it to study when particular rare physical phenomena occur, so like large waves occurring in the ocean. And like I mentioned, they can also use it to prototype particular structural or architectural designs. Essentially, you use this as a source of inspiration, and then you do a lot of work to really understand your problem deeply after you've jogged your brain with some of these ideas coming from the AI tool. And that's roughly where I want to end with this, is that we want to move away from being like the Corinthians, that wisdom is from God. We can never really assume that it is coming from ourselves. artificial intelligence tools, they're there for finding patterns and relationships in data, but they're only one step in the entire creative process, which is something that is driven by ourselves. So if we treat this creative process as something shallow and we just take answers from AI, then our work will really become replaceable, which is what we're afraid of. Our Christian faith, it encourages us to learn and study deeply. We have many parts of the Bible that talk about this. And that as our knowledge evolves, it brings us closer to the real understanding of the problems we want to solve. And lastly, we need to keep ourselves accountable in this task. This is always like a daily thing that we think about when we interact with AI. And as we do this, if we always think about these types of ideas, we'll be able to reclaim our role in the scientific discovery process. That's where I want to end. Thank you. Yeah, questions?
I didn't quite get the message from when you, that example you gave where you injected noise into a set of images.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure I understood the message you were presenting.
Yeah, the message there is to show that I said earlier that ChatGPT is kind of trying to average over the conventional knowledge that we have to this date. And this is a particular example of how a neural network, when you feed it in a bunch of images, it just spits out those images at the end of the day. You can recover them from all of the weights and connections in this network architecture. So it's a very visual example of how
So when you inject a noise, it can still extract the original good data?
Yeah, it tries to just shift the noise closer and closer until it eventually gets you to an image that you fed it when you were training it. Yeah. Yeah.
So where do you see AI in the next 5 to 10 years? Do you think it's going to improve greatly, or?
I think it will, because people are talking about combining it with all sorts of like logical reasoning frameworks. I think that we will be able to get to a point where AI is like a very good friend, and we're able to trust it with some amount of logical reasoning. So if you want to prove a theorem, you can maybe give it a poor proof of this theorem, and then it will be able to iterate it and improve on it. Or it will be able to, let's say, run some sort of a physical simulation with a machine learning method, and then trust its results more than we can currently trust it today. So I think that there's going to be a lot of improvement, but the real thing to remember is that the creative part of this is always coming from us. So we're the ones who get to decide whether to run the machine learning algorithm this way or that way, or like what data to feed into it, or what questions to ask it. That's always coming from us. Yeah.
Good. So this, I don't know whether completely relevant, but when they found the Dead Sea Scrolls, it was all in fragments, most of it, and not a complete scroll because they were so old. But the fragments were once part of a whole.
Mm-hmm.
So part of that is, at some point they knew that one of the scrolls was Isaiah, and they knew the answer. But what the scroll should look like, if you put the pieces together, was Isaiah, because they determined, oh, out of all the different scrolls, and not all of them were meaningful, they found one that they said, oh, this is Isaiah.
Mm-hmm.
And with the assumption that Isaiah had not changed for 2,000 years, they could piece the little pieces of paper together to form Isaiah, something you could recognize. But given these circumstances, this was done by humans, and when they first did it, they weren't going to use Scotch tape to piece it together. But anyway, could AI piece together all those little fragments of paper and make something that at least would be recognizable in the Hebrew language?
So this is where I think it becomes a little tricky, because sure, we could plug in anything we want into AI and it will give us an answer. It loves giving us answers. But the answers it will give us are just a summary of everything it found on the internet. So it will fill things in based on whatever people wrote on Reddit or Wikipedia or anywhere else. And also we're removing this core belief that we have that the Bible was written through inspiration of the Holy Spirit. And therefore, if we give it to a machine learning algorithm, then we are going against that belief. We're not allowing the Holy Spirit to act through humans to write our Holy Scripture, which is how we believe it happened. So I don't think it's a good idea to give it to a machine learning algorithm. That's my understanding. Yeah, okay, so I'm happy to take more questions offline. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.